having a white Australia policy to having a very multicultural policy. And
here we are back again.
And these days we're at what's sometimes called Fortress Australia, and there's been a lot of criticism of Australia's policy on immigration. Can you talk a little bit about that, in particular, interception of immigrants at sea and sent to Papua New Guinea, for example?
Well, it's not just our policy of immigration. I think it's our recent treatment of refugees, and part of what's driven me to become a goodwill ambassador with UNHCR, and the work they do is extraordinary, frontline work. I was bewildered by the kind of the generous, open-hearted nature of the Australia that I grew up in, the multicultural Australia that I grew up in. And the governments, successive governments, I'm not a particularly political person, the treatment of people offshore and flouting the UN refugee convention, human rights conventions, I just couldn't understand it, and I found it really upsetting, because obviously the displacement crisis that the world is experiencing, and my work takes me to various different cultures, and when you work with different film crews, you go inside the culture, and this is a global problem that no one nation can shoulder, no one UN agency can shoulder either, and no one sector can solve. We need collective solutions. But I was very distressed that Australia seemed to be reverting back to practices and attitudes that were making us become a fortress again, and doesn't really reflect, the true generous nature of Australians that I know and encounter.
So it was in part, in a sense, embarrassment at national policies that drove you to your activism on refugees globally?
I think embarrassment sort of is a bit sort of. I think it was deeper than that. I think it's shameful, and also I think there's so much misinformation about refugees. I think that's part of the thing that really upsets me most. From my experience in the field, and these very resilient, resourceful, generous people who have been forced to flee, but yet they're vilified, often in the media. And so a lot of the reports one reads, or the lack of information one gets from what was going on offshore in Papua New Guinea, it doesn't really connect with the actual people that I've met. So I've found the misinformation incredibly upsetting.
And it's not just Fortress Australia, it's Fortress America these days, Fortress Europe. I mean, it's a problem that has afflicted a lot of the world.
No, but it's interesting you talk about those developed countries, is that certainly in Australia, and I'm sure in America, there's a misapprehension that the developed world shoulders the burden of refugees. I mean, there's upward of 66 million people around the world displaced, and 22 million of those are refugees, and half of that number are women and girls, and that it's only 1% have been legally resettled in developed countries like Australia and Europe and the UK and the United States, and so it's the developing world that is actually shouldering the deep burden. And so the neighbouring countries of, places like Jordan or Uganda, sheltering so many South Sudanese refugees, or in Bangladesh. And so the developing world that is struggling to deliver services and are often and there's a lot of political unrest in their own countries. So it's a very unstable, unsafe place for those people to be. And yet countries that I come from are being told this narrative that somehow that these refugees who have so much to offer, we're going to be burdened by them economically, or they're a terrorist threat. So I think it's the misinformation that I find most distressing. I mean, you probably find that in the States as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, as you know, Uganda has more than 1 million South Sudan refugees. A quarter of Lebanon's population is refugees now.
And the sliver that Lebanon actually is, when you look at the size of my country or your country.
Yeah. But I must say that, and I'd be curious about your reaction to this, that as somebody who championed refugees and Syrian refugees, looking back, I wonder if, to some degree, I miscalculated, and I was so, so tough on Germany before it opened the doors, and then so grateful to Merkel when she did. But looking back, I wonder if that championing of refugees, in the case of Germany, for example, didn't end up empowering a lot of ultra-right-wing nationalists across Europe, and also perhaps didn't end up falsely encouraging some Eritreans, South Sudanese to think that if they could indeed just get to Europe, that then the problems would be over, and perhaps encouraging some to take dangerous journeys. And so I must say, looking back, I have some ambivalence about whether I should have,
not talked about it?
No.
I mean, the problem's not going to go away.
No.
I mean, it's interesting you say that, because I do think there's a few issues there. I mean, I think that there's been incredibly welcoming countries around who are bordering the Syrian conflict, who have been full to bursting. As you say, a quarter of Lebanon's population is Syrian refugees. And I think with the leadership that Germany showed, there was an expectation that that would have a domino effect and that the rest of the world would follow suit. Because there has to be a burden share. No one country can house these people. And got to remember, these are not terrorists. These are innocent people. I mean, everyone I've met, they all want to return home. And they want to be useful to the host countries. They are not, and in fact, they are the ones who are at risk, particularly the women and girls, to negative coping strategies like early marriage, because there's, or they're at threat themselves from acts of terrorism or from human trafficking. There's so many conflating issues there. But then I also think it presupposes that the Eritreans that you're talking about have a level of connectivity. And part of the work that UNHCR does with their partner agencies is to try and find ways with tech partners that they can plug refugees back in so they actually know what's going on. So there's so much misinformation that the developed world is getting about refugees, but refugees themselves are only getting a bush telegraph of we can go here, we can go there. It's not, and there was a woman I met in Lebanon in a community centre. I was actually started to work with UNHCR on the issue of statelessness, which is still a very pressing issue. There's 25 countries around the world that don't allow women to confer nationality upon their children, and so statelessness is it can often be a resultant factor of being, a refugee. You have no access to, you can't marry, you can't work, you don't have access to medical care. But anyway, so we had met in this community centre to talk about birth registration, because obviously life goes on, children are born. Children are born of refugees, children are born. And I went around the room and asked what everyone had done, and there were architects, pharmacists, doctors, lawyers, business people, nurses, a lot of professionals. And they were talking about having another meeting the following week. And one woman, she was an architect, had 3 daughters, said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I won't be here next week." And the UN representative said, "Why not? Where will you be?" And she said, "Oh, I'm getting on a boat." And she said, "I'm sorry," and the room just went icy. And this is after Ilan. This is after so many thousands of people had died in the Mediterranean. She knew that, and she said, "I've exhausted all opportunities. My daughters are out of school. My husband has made it to Stockholm. I have to try and reach him. I have no more resources here. I'm a burden on this country. I can no longer stay. I've reached my wit's end." Now, she was an intelligent, educated, professional woman who knew the risks and had no other choice. And so I think that to say that, it empowers them to go, she knew the dangers, but people get so desperate after a certain amount of time. And because there hasn't been that burden sharing, and even the welcoming host countries have had to sort of close their borders down, it becomes increasingly perilous for the refugees.
But looking back, I must say that it does seem to me that essentially the conversation among liberals and advocates for refugees was overwhelmingly about resettlement of refugees in the West. And in retrospect, I wonder if we should have recalibrated that to include more talk about support for refugees in neighboring countries. In Lebanon, for example, where, as you know, half of the refugees were able to go to school, and where for tiny amounts of money much, much less than resettlement costs. One could have actually dramatically improved the lives of refugees there, or likewise in Sudanese refugees from the Nuba Mountains in South Sudan who were just living in desperate shape, or Rohingya right now in Bangladesh. And I do wonder if maybe the number of people who are resettled in the West is going to be a small share overall. And I wonder if we should devote more of the conversation. If maybe more of the conversation should be about trying to drum up generosity toward support for those people in neighboring countries. Obviously, one needs both.
Well, a lot of the UNHCR's partners are generous donations, but they're chronically underfunded as an organisation, and so about 80% comes from government funding, but they've got to fundraise from the private sector and private donations. But these various crises, and what crises have been solved, they've just got worse. As the crises go on longer, then the money doesn't spread as far, and it means that the organisations like the UNHCR can only provide those essential services like water and shelter and medical attention. They can't then deal with the longer term issues of generations of children being out of education. And I think that's, my mother was talking to me about some South Sudanese violence, young South Sudanese kids in Melbourne in Australia, where I'm from. And it's because the kids have been out of school for so long, and the level of trauma that a refugee experiences on the journey to a host country, and then if they're vilified when they get there, it compounds the trauma. So it's it's a whole lot of complicating factors. So that, the financial contributions are absolutely vital, but I think it's also countries saying, well, you know what? In previous decades, think about like your father, like that wave of immigration, and we're in a far greater displacement crisis than in the Second World War. How much those refugees and immigrants have offered a country like America. And how, look at the Fortune 500, there's, 114 of those companies are run by the children of immigrants. And, so it's...
one of the constraints, frankly, is politics. It's very easy for a journalist or an actor to call for more generosity to refugees. The reason politicians have been much tougher is they're reacting to their constituencies. And it does seem to me that fundamentally...
Or are they reacting to the media? And it's really interesting. It's because I don't think that populist media necessarily represents all pockets of a society. And so I think it's the news cycle does drive, I think, a lot of political decisions rather than the population. So I think we are all citizens, we are all consumers, and and we're lucky enough to live in democracies, so we have to participate in those democracies and act. I think we are sort of what you're describing. We're at a fork in the road, really. And I'm a mother of 4, and what do I say to my children? We try and teach our children to be compassionate, to be tolerant, to accept diversity, to share. But yet all of the structures that are around them are not doing the same thing. So it's quite a schizophrenic world that they're living in. And I personally want to go down the compassionate path. I think there's far more opportunity. When you diversify your workforce, when you diversify your population in Australia, I can't think what would have happened if we hadn't had those waves of refugees coming and we'd been welcoming. Our country would have been quarter of as interesting as it is today. There's so many benefits from being welcoming, and I think that politicians it's sort of entrenched, lazy, short-term thinking. And I certainly don't know when turning back innocent people who've gotten into a boat became an election-winning proposition. I just don't understand how that happened.
I must say, I think politicians are probably correctly reading their publics, unfortunately. I do think that politicians can use political... I do think politicians can use their political capital in a way that they haven't. I think Justin Trudeau is an interesting example of somebody who seized the issue and then went to the airport to hand out jackets to Syrian refugees arriving and asserted we are being Canadian when we welcome Syrian refugees.
And then when he didn't resettle enough as quickly as he said he would, he was criticised by his, that's one type of incredible, leadership there. It does take leadership. But it also, I mean, while we wait for political solutions, which are taking a very long time to come about, it's a very, very complicated global situation. I don't want to oversimplify it. But the private sector can step in. You know, there's a huge opportunity that the private sector can act with a really reinvigorated moral compass. What sort of company do we want what brand is our company? Do we want to be a compassionate, welcoming, open-hearted, globally connected, relevant company? Or do we want to be a shut-down, xenophobic company? I mean, that's part of how we can rebrand ourselves as organisations. I think that there's where there's that sort of black hole of leadership, perhaps in government, the private sector can step in, I think.
And, I mean, you're kind of an empathy business, whether whether acting or working with refugees.
Yeah.
And, you know, I wonder whether there is more room for the entertainment industry to use storytelling to open hearts. I mean, apparently the book Black Beauty was crucial in making people thinking more of animal rights. Uncle Tom's Cabin famously created more compassion for slaves. And I remember in the time of Darfur, Hotel Rwanda was, really helped change attitudes. And so I wonder if, to the extent that there are a lot of people, a lot of actors who care about this issue, if there is more room to have some storytelling that in theaters would actually help open hearts and make people aware of what refugees can contribute.
Well, definitely my experience, and having had the privilege through my work as a Goodwill Ambassador with UNHCR, meeting refugees, it's certainly influenced and informed the type of work that I not only want to make, but that I'm interested in consuming. I mean, I don't see art, whether that be film or visual arts or music, I don't see it as being educative. I think schools are the place for education. Your home life can be the source of education. I think art is more provocation. And I think what happens all too quickly is that we can get into the space of stories telling us what to think. Whereas I think my role as a storyteller, as an actor, is to open a conversation. I think art's a provocation. And I think what's really grown up now that doesn't seem to be as much space for deep time investigative journalism is that the role of the documentary has become incredibly powerful. And I think that's certainly for me, there's been a lot of various different stories that I've been able to have opened sort of doors in my imagination and in my heart that have come through the documentary space. Like Ai Weiwei's Human Flow, for instance.
I always kind of feel the documentaries preach to the choir.
Not good documentaries.
Yeah.
I think you're talking about shitty art. Not good art. I mean, I don't ever see my role, when I'm playing a character. I think you have to present people warts and all. Like it's if I was playing Melania Trump, not that I would probably be cast in that role, but I wouldn't be necessarily coming from the place of free Melania. I'd be trying to understand the situation so that you could then throw that back at an audience and say, what's her position as a woman? What does she think? What's it like to be married to? Anyway, change the subject.
So Melania, if you're watching, and here's your chance.
Yeah. But you know what I mean? I think that, but definitely, I mean, I think that there's a role for conversation, and I think there's in my position suddenly an actor of international standing who's achieved certain things gets called a celebrity when they attach themselves, limp-like to a cause, and that can be counterproductive. But I think if you do have a platform, any of us have a platform, I think it's you can either use that responsibly and and generously, or you can use it to talk about what you're wearing. I mean, So what is
the role of celebrities in these causes?
Well,
generally?
Here I am. I mean, my role as a Goodwill Ambassador, and I'm not and I'm not an expert. I suppose I'm more a witness. I've had the privilege to go into the field and meet some extraordinary people who happen to be refugees. And so I think it's to bring those stories back, to bring the human face back to those enormous numbers, because I think the numbers are overwhelming and can make us all disconnect. You know, it's what can I do in the face of, you know, upwards of 65 million people displaced? I can't do anything. But when you re-engage with a single story, you don't know what's going to make a point of connection. So I think that's part of my, you know, my role, and also advocacy and helping to fundraise for the organisations. And it's amazing when you do meet people, because I'm not here to judge, I'm not here to preach. You know, when you actually do start having just genuine, open-minded conversations, and you need to listen. I mean, I'm doing a lot of talking right now, but I can also listen. But it's important to listen. I think we're all out there pontificating about what we think, what we believe, but you've got to countenance opinions that are not necessarily your own. You do have to see things from all perspectives. It's the only way to find sustainable solutions.
I always think, you know, celebrities can't escape cameras, and the problem with so many populations around the world is they can't get any camera attention. And so it's so useful when celebrities drag those cameras to bring that lens onto refugees or whatever population it may be, and that help bring that spotlight to people who, because they don't get attention, their needs never get addressed. So thank you for doing that.
No, but it's also through your work. I was saying to you before that I saw your piece on Myanmar, and it was deeply, deeply distressing and galvanising, because we can't let it go on. You know, as a woman, as a mother, you know, when I've seen so many young children who are out of school, and you know, when I was in Zatri in Zatri camp, I took my 9-year-old son with me, and we were with a family, and he was playing soccer with this boy. They couldn't even speak the same language, you know, and another boy was sitting watching them, and he said, I want him to come and play, and he won't come and play. And I said, darling, that's because he's got shrapnel in his foot, you know, because they had to flee from Syria because their house was bombed, internally displaced for 9 months, didn't know who was shooting at them. But finally, when the son was shot at, they had to run across the border. And so it's just remembering that stuff, I think, that's really, really important. And
what's happening in Burma and with the Rohingya is, of course, compounded that this is happening, this is being presided over by a Nobel Peace Prize winner.
It's bewildering, isn't it? But it's also, it began further back than that too. I mean, when the citizenship laws in '92 came in, talking about statelessness, the Rohingya became stateless. So they were already a disenfranchised, vilified population. So this has been a ticking time bomb. But the problem is the typhoons and the rains are coming in March and April. So their situation is becoming increasingly perilous.
And now the thought that they may be repatriated against their will, to be put in concentration camps back in Myanmar, is just unconscionable.
I know it is unconscionable, and it's the UNHCR really does work incredibly hard to make the point that you can only repatriate a refugee into a safe place. You know, they flee often with a minute's notice, with next to nothing, from, you know, extreme violence and persecution, and that is not an economic migrant.
We're running out of time, but tell me about I don't know, the most moving encounter. You visited refugees in plenty of places. What should we think about? I mean, who comes to mind when you think of a refugee? What is the most moving encounter you've had, perhaps?
Gosh, there's so many. And this is the thing, it's every refugee experience. They're all individuals and all their stories are really unique. But I suppose for me what comes to mind, because often we think of refugees as being in camps, and there are many in camps and overflowing in camps, but often it's the urban refugee that are most at risk and most isolated. And I visited in Jordan Abu and Muhammad, and they had 6 children. They left 1 daughter who'd been married in and they loved Oms, and they didn't want to leave. They were internally displaced for 18 months. Once again, they were being shot at from all sides. They had one daughter with cerebral palsy, and 1 4-year-old boy who at the time I met him hadn't spoken for almost 2 years. and he was so traumatized by the internal displacement. And I asked who was shooting at them, and he looked at me like I was insane. He said, "I don't know who was shooting at me. I have no idea." So you don't even know who to trust. But so much so they wanted to stay with their 6 children that they travelled around from neighbouring village until finally they were forced to flee. And I asked him and Mohammed what they brought with them. And they said, well, we had 3 suitcases. But as we got closer and closer to the border, they had to run because they were being shot at. And he said he had the choice. He had the choice to carry his suitcases or his children, and he had to carry his children, and I find that really, that stays with me.
That's the kind of thing that one can absolutely never forget.
And children are bloody heavy. I know, I've got 4 of them.
Well, thank you for leaving us with that story and for reminding us that those 65 million people out there, that's that family times 65 million.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank all of you for coming. And Kate, I'd like to thank you as a son of a refugee, as I said, for your work.
Look at you now.
And I don't know about that, but thank you very much for your work.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Kate.